There was once a place on Earth where no government ruled, no police walked the halls, no building inspector ever signed off on a single wall, no tax collector dared to knock, it had no mayor, no laws anyone enforced, and no map that could truly capture it. And into a space smaller than most city parks, roughly the size of a single city block, more than 33,000 people packed themselves in, stacked on top of one another in a black tangle of concrete and wire that rose 14 stories into the Hong Kong sky. They called it the City of Darkness. And for decades, it was the most densely crowded patch of ground in the history of the human race. If you had flown into Hong Kong's old airport in the 1980s, you would have seen it from your window as the plane made its terrifying low turn over the rooftops. Down below, in a city already famous for being crowded, there was one block that looked wrong. A single solid mass of buildings fused together into what looked like one enormous rotting structure with no gaps, no space, and almost no light getting in. That was Kowloon Walled City. And what happened inside it is one of the strangest true stories of the 20th century. To understand how a lawless city grew in the middle of modern Hong Kong, you have to go back to a diplomatic accident. The site started its life centuries ago as a Chinese military fort, a walled garrison on the Kowloon Peninsula, built to guard the coast and manage the salt trade. For a long time, it was nothing remarkable. Then, in 1898, everything changed because of a single line in a treaty. Britain, which already controlled Hong Kong, signed a 99-year lease with China to take over the surrounding area known as the New Territories, but China insisted on one exception. It wanted to keep this little walled fort and the officials inside it under Chinese control. Britain agreed, almost without thinking, and that tiny concession created a hole in the map, because from that point on, nobody was truly in charge. The British said the fort was theirs. The Chinese said it was theirs. Within a year, the British marched in to take it, found the Chinese officials had left, and then, over the following decades, simply chose not to govern the place. It was a diplomatic headache neither side wanted to touch, and so this one square of land became something almost unheard of in the modern world, a genuine no-man's land claimed by two governments and administered by neither, a legal black hole in the middle of one of the most tightly controlled cities on the planet. For a while, it stayed small, then came the war. During the Second World War, Japan occupied Hong Kong, and Japanese forces tore down the old stone wall that gave the city its name, using the rubble to expand the nearby airport. When the war ended and the war was gone, something the authorities never anticipated happened. Refugees came. Hong Kong was flooded with people fleeing the chaos and the civil war on the Chinese mainland, and they needed somewhere, anywhere, to live. And here was a place with no landlords to answer to, no permits to file, and no police to move you along. So they moved in, and they started to build. What they built had no plan. There was no architect, no engineer, no blueprint for any of it. Residents simply put up structures wherever they could, and when there was no more room to build outward, they built upward, adding floors on top of floors, throwing walls between one building and the next, connecting rooftops with ladders and dark stairwells, until 350 separate buildings had merged into a single continuous living organism of concrete. There was one strange rule that shaped the whole place from above. The buildings could rise only so high, capped at around 14 stories, not by any planning law of their own, but because the airport sat right next door, and the jets came screaming in only feet above the rooftops each day. It was the one limit the outside world managed to impose, and it came not from a government, but from the flight path. At its peak, the density inside reached a level that is difficult to even picture. Depending on the estimate, it worked out to well over 1 million people per square kilometre. Life inside was a world unto itself. On the ground floor, in the narrow gaps between buildings that passed for streets, daylight never reached. The alleys were so tight and so overhung by the structures above that residents walked through them in permanent twilight, under a ceiling of tangled electrical wires and dripping water pipes that never stopped leaking. People used umbrellas indoors walking through the lower passages because the water falling from the plumbing above never truly stopped. The air was thick. The corridors were a maze that outsiders got lost in within minutes, and that even the police in the early years were said to be afraid to enter. To live there, you learned the paths by heart. To visit, you needed a guide. Even the basics of survival had to be improvised. Officially, the city had no water supply and no power grid of its own, so the residents built their own. They dug wells deep into the ground and installed electric pumps that ran day and night, pushing water up through a chaos of pipes to tanks on the rooftops. Electricity was mostly stolen, tapped illegally from the lines of the city outside, a web of wiring so dangerous and so tangled that fires were a constant threat. Nothing about it was legal, somehow all of it worked, and with no law the criminal world moved in first. From the 1950s onward, the walled city became a stronghold for the triads, the organised crime syndicates of Hong Kong. They ran opium dens where addicts lay in rows. They ran brothels and gambling parlours. Heroin was refined and sold openly in a place where no officer was coming to stop it. For a period, the City of Darkness earned its reputation honestly, as a genuine den of vice that the rest of Hong Kong looked at with fear and disgust. It took a massive, sustained police campaign in the early 1970s, thousands of raids over a short span, to finally break the grip of the triads and drag the worst of the crime out into the light. But here is the part of the story that surprises people. Strip away the triads, and what was left was not a monster, it was a neighbourhood, because tens of thousands of ordinary working people lived in that darkness, and they built something like a functioning society inside the lawlessness. With no regulations to stop them, the walled city filled with businesses that couldn't exist anywhere else. It became famous, of all things, for its dentists. Because you didn't need an expensive government license to practice inside the walled city, dozens of dentists set up shop there, offering cheap dental work to people from all over Hong Kong, their storefront signs glowing at the edges of the city. There were unlicensed doctors, there were factories crammed into apartments, turning out fish balls and noodles and candy that were sold across the territory, made in kitchens no health inspector would ever see. There were schools, temples, and a Buddhist association. There was, famously, a single mailman who somehow delivered letters to more than 30,000 people in a place with no real addresses, memorizing the impossible geography of it all. Families raised children there, kids played on the rooftops, the only open space the city had, flying kites above the smog, while jets roared low overhead on their way to the airport. Neighbours knew each other, doors were left unlocked, and many of the people who lived there, when asked about it years later, did not describe a hell at all. They described home. A crowded, filthy, dangerous, deeply human home, held together by the people in it precisely because no one from the outside was holding it together for them. In its final years, a handful of outsiders finally went in to record the place before it disappeared. 2 photographers spent years inside, earning the residents' trust and capturing the businesses, the families, and the dark corridors and thousands of images. What they found shattered the simple story of a den of crime, showing old women cooking, children doing homework by the light of a single bulb, barbers and priests and metalworkers, an entire civilization living in conditions the outside world had written off as uninhabitable. But a place like that could not last forever, and both governments knew it. As the 1997 handover of Hong Kong from Britain back to China approached, the two sides finally had a reason and the political will to resolve the century-old headache once and for all. In 1987, they jointly announced that the walled city would be demolished. The government carried out a census of the residents, counting the uncountable, and offered them billions in compensation and new homes elsewhere. Many took the money, others fought to stay, protesting the loss of the only community they had ever known. And in 1993, the wrecking balls arrived. By the following year, the densest place that had ever existed on Earth was gone, reduced to nothing but dust and rubble, its million per square kilometre world flattened into empty ground. Today, if you go to that spot in Hong Kong, you will not find a single trace of the darkness. In its place is a quiet, beautiful public park with manicured gardens, ponds and pavilions. Old people practice Tai Chi where the opium dens once stood. The only thing that remains of the original site is a small restored building from the ancient fort and a bronze scale model showing what the impossible city once looked like, so that visitors can stand in the sunlight and try to imagine the sunless world that used to rise 14 stories above their heads. And that is perhaps the strangest thing of all. A place that was, by every official measure, a slum, a crime haven, an ungovernable mistake, is now remembered by the people who survived it with something close to love. It has inspired films, video games, and artists around the world, all drawn to the same haunting idea, that human beings, given no rules and no help and almost no space, did not simply descend into chaos. They built a city, a terrible, brilliant, teeming city, entirely their own, in the one place on Earth where no government could ever tell them how to live. And then, in the space of a single year, they watched it vanish, as if it had never been there at all. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe, because the world's landmarks are hiding stories far darker than fiction. I'll see you in the next one.